Here's something most people get backwards. They think rich people spend a lot of money because they have a lot of money, and poor people don't spend much because they don't have much to spend. But if you actually look at spending behavior, you'll find the opposite is true. Rich people spend less, poor people spend more. Not in absolute dollars, but as a percentage of what they have, and in frequency, and in impulse, and in emotional motivation. The wealthier you are, the less you feel the need to spend. The poorer you are, the more you're driven to consume. And this isn't a moral failure, it's a structural reality. Let me show you what I mean. When you have money, spending becomes boring. You can buy whatever you want, whenever you want. So the urgency disappears, the dopamine hit fades, consumption loses its appeal. But when you don't have money, every purchase feels significant. Every small luxury feels like an achievement. A new pair of shoes, a nice meal, a small treat. These aren't just purchases, they're emotional compensations for a life that constantly denies you. And here's the key. Poor people don't overspend because they're financially illiterate. They overspend because spending is one of the few ways to feel temporary relief from the stress of being poor. This is what psychologists call scarcity mindset. When you live in scarcity, your brain is always in survival mode. And survival mode doesn't optimize for long-term wealth. It optimizes for short-term comfort. Think about how the brain processes scarcity. Researchers have found that when people experience financial scarcity, their cognitive function drops. Not because they're less intelligent, but because their mental bandwidth is consumed by worry. When you're constantly thinking, can I pay rent? Can I fix my car? Can I afford groceries? Your brain has less capacity for long-term planning. So what happens? You make decisions based on immediate emotional needs. You see something that makes you feel good. You buy it. Because in that moment, the psychological relief is worth more than the money. This is why poor people are more likely to buy lottery tickets. It's not stupidity. It's hope. A $5 lottery ticket represents the possibility of escape. And when escape feels impossible through work, hope becomes worth the price. Rich people don't buy lottery tickets, not because they're smarter, but because they don't need hope. They already have escape. Now compare this to how rich people experience money. When you're wealthy, money is abundant. There's no scarcity pressure. So your brain doesn't attach emotional significance to spending. You walk past a store, you see something nice, you think, I could buy that. And then you don't, because you don't need to. The option is always there. This is what psychologists call delayed gratification. But it's not willpower, it's certainty. When you're certain that you can have something whenever you want, you stop wanting it urgently. When you're uncertain whether you'll ever be able to afford it again, you grab it now. Same item, different psychology, different behavior. Here's where it gets interesting. Poor people are constantly told they need to save more. Budget better, stop buying unnecessary things. But here's what nobody explains. Saving requires emotional energy, and emotional energy is a limited resource. If you're working 2 jobs, dealing with an unstable living situation, worrying about bills, managing family stress, you don't have emotional energy left for financial discipline. So at the end of a hard week, when you see something that offers a moment of pleasure, you take it. Not because you're irresponsible, but because you're human. And humans need relief. Rich people also need relief, but they get it from other sources. Vacations, hobbies, social status. They don't need to buy things to feel better because their baseline emotional state is already comfortable. Let me give you a concrete example. A poor person works a minimum wage job, 40 hours a week, paycheck to paycheck. Stressful environment, no control over their schedule. They come home exhausted. They open their phone. They see an ad for something they want. $50. They think, I've been working so hard, I deserve this. And they buy it. Not because they have $50 to spare, but because the emotional value of that purchase, the feeling of deserving something, of having control over one small decision, is worth more than the financial cost. Now think about a wealthy person. They work hard too, but their work feels meaningful. They have control. They have status. They have options. They come home, they see the same ad, and they think, I could buy that, but I don't need it. And they don't buy it. Not because they're disciplined, but because they don't need the emotional compensation. Same ad, same product, different lives, different spending behavior. Now let's talk about social spending. When you're poor, spending is often about signaling, proving you're not as poor as people think, showing you can afford things, maintaining social dignity. This is why poor neighborhoods often have more visible consumption. New sneakers, expensive phones, car rims. People look at this and say, if they're so poor, why are they buying expensive things? But they're missing the point. Those purchases aren't about utility. They're about status, about respect, about not being invisible. When society constantly tells you you're worthless because you're poor, buying something expensive is a way to say, I matter. Rich people don't need to signal status through consumption. Their status is assumed. They live in the right neighborhood. They went to the right schools. They know the right people. So they can afford to look modest, to wear simple clothes, to drive a normal car. because their wealth is already visible through context. Poor people don't have that luxury. If they look poor, they're treated as poor. So they spend to avoid that treatment. Here's another structural factor: access to discounts. Rich people spend less because they have access to better prices. They can buy in bulk, Costco membership, wholesale clubs. They can wait for sales because they're not desperate. They can afford upfront payments that come with discounts, annual subscriptions, insurance paid yearly, mortgages with large down payments. Poor people don't have these options. They buy small quantities because they can't afford bulk. They pay monthly instead of annually. Higher rates, more fees. They buy cheap products that break quickly, so they end up spending more over time. Rich people buy expensive boots that last 10 years. Poor people buy cheap boots that last 1 year. And after 10 years, they've spent twice as much. It's expensive to be poor. And here's the trap. The poorer you are, the more you spend emotionally. The more you spend emotionally, the less you save. The less you save, the poorer you stay. And society looks at this cycle and says, poor people are bad with money. But that's not what's happening. What's happening is that poverty creates psychological conditions that make saving nearly impossible. It's not a personal failing. It's a systemic design. Now compare this to wealthy people. The more money they have, the less they need to spend for emotional reasons. The less they spend, the more they accumulate. The more they accumulate, the less emotional attachment they have to money. And society looks at this and says, rich people are disciplined, but it's not discipline, it's abundance. When you have enough, you don't need to prove anything. And when you don't have enough, every purchase is a statement. Let's revisit the famous marshmallow test. Kids are given 1 marshmallow. They're told, wait 15 minutes and you'll get 2 marshmallows. Kids from wealthy families tend to wait. Kids from poor families tend to eat it immediately. And people conclude, rich kids have better self-control. But that's not what the test measures. The test measures trust. Rich kids wait because they've learned that adults keep promises, that delayed rewards actually arrive. Poor kids eat the marshmallow immediately because they've learned that if you don't take what's in front of you, it might disappear. Their parents promise things and can't deliver, not out of malice, but out of economic instability. We'll go to McDonald's this weekend, but then the car breaks down. I'll buy you that toy next month. But then an unexpected bill arrives, so the child learns, take what you can get now, because later might not come. The same psychology applies to adult spending. Rich people delay gratification easily because they trust the future. They know the money will still be there. The opportunity will still exist. Poor people struggle to delay gratification because they don't trust the future. They've learned that opportunities disappear. So when they have money, they spend it because keeping it doesn't guarantee it'll be there tomorrow. And here's what nobody talks about. The system benefits from poor people spending. Payday loans, rent-to-own furniture, high-interest credit cards, lottery tickets. These industries exist to extract money from people who don't have money, and they're enormously profitable. If poor people stopped spending emotionally, these industries would collapse. So there's no structural incentive to teach financial literacy. There's no systemic push to address the emotional drivers of poverty spending, because poverty spending is profitable for everyone except the poor. So here's the reality. Rich people spend less, not because they're more disciplined, but because they don't need to spend for emotional relief, because they have access to better prices, because they don't need to signal status through consumption, because they trust that delayed rewards will arrive. And poor people spend more, not because they're irresponsible, but because spending is one of the few sources of immediate psychological relief in a life defined by scarcity and stress. This isn't about morality, it's about structure. The wealthier you are, the easier it becomes to spend less. The poorer you are, the harder it becomes to save. And the gap widens, not because of individual choices, but because the system is designed this way, and nobody wants to admit it. Because if we admitted it, we'd have to change it. And changing it would cost the people who benefit from it. So instead, we tell poor people to budget better. And we congratulate rich people for their discipline, and the cycle continues.